Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Christiana Limniadis, Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara, and welcome to Research to Landmark, tonight's program in celebration of Preservation Month in the glorious month of May. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. How tonight is going to work is that I am going to talk to you about all of the different types of documents that you need to consult, the baseline documents that you need to consult to do research on a historic property with the goal of landmarking that property. We'll also touch base briefly on those types of landmarking and just kind of give you that really basic information about what those nominations look like at the end so that you can have that information in your brain while you're doing your research. But the vast majority of tonight is going to focus on what those documents that you need to look at are and how to access them. In explaining how to access those documents, we are going to be using Erie County as the example. So most of the resources and document types that we're going to talk about are the ones that are where they are in Erie County, but I'm definitely going to mention other repositories in our other 4 counties in our service area, and we'll be sharing links to those sources and other documents that I reference in that chat button. I hope that you guys are going to have lots and lots of questions tonight because this might be new topic for some of you. So definitely eager to hear all of the questions that you have. If you have a question, please make sure to use that Q&A button to ask those questions. There is the chat box that you can use to share tidbits or facts that you're sharing. And I know my coworker Tia, who is here to help me moderate this evening, like I said, is going to be sharing links to the various websites that we're going to talk about and other sources. But make sure that you put the questions that you want me to answer in that Q&A box. I think that was all of my housekeeping things. Oh, lastly, we are recording this program tonight, so it will be made available on our YouTube page once that has been processed. So keep an eye out for that, especially for some of you who I know have reached out that have a conflict this evening and might need to step out early. The recording will be available on YouTube. All right, so Preservation Buffalo Niagara, for those of you who are new to PBN, we are your local advocacy organization. Our mission is to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture and historic legacy, and to connect people to the places they love in Western New York. That's a very broad service area. A broad mission, and we apply that mission and try to work towards that mission in our service area, which is the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So while our name has Buffalo and Niagara in it, we are actually here providing services for all of Western New York. When I say that we're providing services for our 5 county service area, what does that mean? It means that we divide our work into 4 main categories: education, technical services, advocacy, and community development. Education tonight is a perfect example of education, whether it's fun factoids about architecture or nitty-gritty information about how to research buildings. We are here to give you that information you need to better understand and appreciate our built environment, and then be able to take those steps to preserve those resources. Technical service, PBN staff is here to answer any questions that you may have, any preservation related questions that you may have, whether that is kind of a technical materiality question: how do I fix this? What is this part of my building? Or maybe a preservation planning question: how do I complete this landmark nomination? How do I access historic tax credits? Any type of preservation question, we are here to help you with that. And advocacy and community development are basically the same thing, but for us, advocacy is where we are taking the lead in preserving that resource, saving that resource, advocating for legislation that would advance historic preservation, whereas community development is where we come into your community and give you the tools and knowledge that you need to be in charge of your own preservation destiny. Like I said before, PBN, we have a 5 county service area. So even outside of the pandemic, it's impossible for us to be at every committee meeting in front of every wrecking ball. So to make sure that you have what you need to be a proper steward and successful steward of your historic built environment is incredibly important to us. And when I say us, I'm talking about these smiling faces, the staff of PBN. Our executive director is Jessie Fisher. There's me, Mary, Tia, who is secretly on this webinar being our moderator, and Tabitha and Bridge round out the crew. I do want to, just make sure that you guys are aware, it is Preservation Month. We always have our preservation awards in the month of May, and ours is happening on the 27th. So again, if you're interested in learning more about the great preservation work that has been happening over the last year, it would be a great evening to join us there. We have some guest speakers. We might even be giving out some prizes if you answer some trivia questions correctly. It might be a great, great time. So you should think about joining us. And lastly, I do just need to thank our sponsors that made tonight possible. So Erie County Humanities New York, National Endowment for the Humanities, and PBN membership. Oh, excuse me. We are a membership-based organization. So while we can reach out to funders like these to help provide funding to keep specific programs going, like educational programming, the vast majority of our mission-based work that we do is supported by our PBN membership dollars and donations. You can't really write a grant to stop a demolition. So it is those membership dollars and other donations that allow us to do that last minute on the ground work. So if you are not, thank you so much for those of you who are already members. If you're not and you have a lovely time with us tonight, I strongly encourage you to head over to our website and to look at those different options of membership and donations. Also, many of you actually also made a donation when you registered tonight. So thank you so very much to those of you who did that. Again, we do like to try to keep our educational programming free and open to the public so that that cost isn't prohibiting you from accessing all of this information, but it's only through those continued donations that we're able to keep this programming free. So again, thank you so much for your previous support and look to it into the future. All right, let us get on to researching things. Again, as I said in the beginning, questions galore. Please send them whenever they pop into your head in that Q&A section. Tia is going to judge and look at those questions and identify, if I need to be interrupted immediately, if we can wait for one of those question breaks. So just type those questions as you need. All right, so why are you researching? Before you even begin researching the property, the resource that you're interested in, it's important to kind of identify, what is the purpose of this? Is this going to be for my personal enjoyment? Is it my home or a home owned by my family, and we're just interested in doing the research on it as we are doing our genealogical research? Or is this for preservation planning purposes? Is your end goal to locally landmark this property? Is it to get it listed on the National Register? Ultimately, the path that you go forward on your research isn't going to be that different depending on your answer to that question. You're still going to look at the same sources and try to find the same information. But if you're going into this with the goal of a preservation planning end result, of a landmark nomination of some sort, then you definitely need to be organized and preparing your mind in a different way than if you're just for fun collecting this information. And also the types of resources that you're going to be consulting. You might, you want to focus on more of those, professional, official kind of resources for those preservation planning documents, where you don't necessarily, if you're just researching for your own personal edification and enjoyment of your home, you don't necessarily need to consult textbooks about different matters that come up in your research. So understanding your end goal with your research is really important. In doing that and in formulating why are you moving forward in this research project, it's also important to kind of come up with those key questions that you want answered about your property. And so here is a screenshot of some of those types of questions that you want to be asking yourself so that you make sure that you are uncovering, or at least attempting to uncover, that full history and significance of that site. And these questions are, I didn't come up with them. The National Park Service came up with these questions in their document called Researching a Historic Property. That is a National Register bulletin. They are a publication series produced by the National Park Service that highlight different steps and explain different steps of the National Register process. And so one of those is this Researching a Historic Property document. The document itself is written for a national audience. So a lot of the advice that they give about what documents to look at and how to access those documents are really, really general and vaguely written to apply to everyone in the country. But this specific section and how to analyze and interpret those sources is something that this document does good. So again, these questions you want to ask yourself. Was there other names that the property was known as? Have there been changes over time to that property? So again, getting your brain set around what your end result is and all the different types of questions that you want to find out about your property is really important to do from the get-go. Also in that process is getting organized, right? So before you're inundated with all that data, before you have all these PDFs saved on your computer and all these copier scans and microfilm printouts in a folder, you want to figure out how you're going to organize them. And so showing you how to organize, physical pieces of paper, I think it's a lot easier to organize, put all your deeds together, put all your whatever together. But digitally, I just wanted to give you guys a glimpse of how I like to organize my documents. When we talk about that local landmark nomination, that National Register nomination that could potentially come out of your research, the narratives that you're going to write for those things are usually going to focus on telling a chronological story of that site. So for me, I love saving my documents on my computer in a chronological order. So I always save them with the year of that document first. I like to put a dash or an underscore and then a one-word descriptor of what that resource is. So you can see here my folder for this property, I think it was 22 Elm. And so you see at 1889, I have a newspaper article, and then there's my little description of what that article was, the title of it, or the contents of that article that helped me understand what that document is. Again, this is helpful for me because if I know I have a question or an issue with this map that I had from the 1845, I can go through my folder quite easily and find 1845 and figure out which one is the map file that I want to access. So again, everyone else's organizational styles are going to be different, but getting your head around what that process is before you have all those documents is going to be so helpful. And then, you have all these documents, you're inundated with all this information. How do you get all this data funneled down so that you can actually be organized enough to write a narrative history of that site? And for me, I like to create an Excel spreadsheet document. So I create just real simple document in Excel, a column for the date, a column for the source, a column for, the page number or the section or any sort of, qualifying characteristic to find it later, and then my notes of what that document is, what it says, whatever information is conveyed in that document. I like to do it this way because then I can no matter how I research or what document order I'm going into, I can put all this information in this Excel spreadsheet and then be able to click one little button to put it in chronological order for me. So I can better see, so I have all this data and then better see kind of what is that narrative history that I'm creating? What is that chronology that I am then going to articulate in a narrative form? The other reason I like doing it this way is because I add the color coding to it. I very much love fancy features in Excel. And so I add color coding to it. So whenever I type in the word deed, it's going to turn to a particular color. I type tax assessments or city directory records, and it's going to have that color. So again, I can just quickly visually scan this list and see, you know what, for this time period, I'm missing this type of resource. Did I check those resources yet? Maybe I haven't. So then it's a reminder to go check those resources. Or maybe I have checked it and there's just I wasn't successful the first time. Maybe I need to try again. Maybe I need to figure out a different way to consult that type of document. So in that regard, having this Excel spreadsheet kind of helps me make sure that I am following up on all of those sources and types of information that I can. And I have to say, I inherited this idea of the Excel spreadsheet from a former coworker. I started my first job that involved doing research on historic properties was way back when in the early 2000s when I was the plaque researcher for Historic Albany Foundation. And this is what my predecessor gave me on our 2004 computers, was a remedial version of this Excel spreadsheet that I have continued all these years later. All right, so let's quickly talk about the two different types, the two major types of designations that you could have as your end result for your historic research project, and just briefly explain what that nomination package is going to look like at the end. Again, just to give you that headspace of what that final product is going to look like, so that I need to make sure that I'm getting all of that information that I need to be able to produce that document at the end. So the first designation that's available is going to be the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register of Historic Places was enabled by the National Preservation Act, Historic Preservation Act in 1966. It is our federal government's official listing of significant sites or districts, structures, objects, resources in general, that have significance and are worthy of preservation for that historic significance. It's an honorary designation. Along with that honorary designation, it does also open the door to some financial incentives, historic tax credits for for-profit property owners, and some grant programs for nonprofit property owners. It's an important land use tool to help you study and learn more about your historic resource. And then the last key thing to keep in mind about the National Register is that owner approval is required to get items, resources listed on the National Register. So again, if you are doing this research of a separate home that you do not own or reside in, and your end goal is to get listed on the National Register, you need to know from the get-go that that property owner's approval is going to be necessary in that process. So keeping that in your mind is really important so that you can have that conversation and pursue that opportunity with that property owner. The general process for how the National Register nominations work: you cannot just write a National Register nomination today and mail it off to the National Park Service tomorrow. Unfortunately, that is just not how it is. There are some levels of bureaucracy in this process. And here in New York State, how that works is, first you have to approach the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, and you need to get a determination of eligibility for that property. So you first need to work with the SHPO staff people to provide them with basic information about that resource so they can confirm, is it actually eligible for the National Register? And if it is eligible, under what criteria it's going to be. So that is a first step that has to be taken. You can do research about the property before you secure that determination of eligibility, but you can't really go forward and create and draft a National Register nomination without that determination of eligibility on file. Once you get the green light from SHPO staff that yes, this is eligible and this is why it's eligible, you can get started on that nomination. So you do all that work to get that nomination. We'll talk about what the different parts are in the next slide. That nomination is then, once it's approved by that SHPO staff person, it's sent on to the state board review, where they review all the National Register nominations in the state. They evaluate them as whether or not they should be listed on the state register. And if they pass that approval, they are then forwarded to the federal government for consideration onto the National Register of Historic Places. When we talk about the parts of a National Register nomination, this is what we're talking about. First and foremost, the National Register nomination does have an application form. It's a couple of pages long. It's pretty much fill in the blanks and check boxes with 10 different sections. So each of those sections focus on a different aspect of the resource or its architecture, its history, and you're just filling in the blanks for those questions. How do you fill in the blanks on those questions? You access the National Register Bulletin of how to complete the National Register form. And so that bulletin, similar to the instruction sheets for your taxes, when you do your taxes and you have the individual schedule forms that you have to fill out, they have those instruction sheets that literally go, what does number 1 mean? What does number 2 mean? This book is organized that same exact way. So in that application form, there's 10 sections. And of those sections, there are several that then require attachments. So section 7 on the form also requires an attachment of a full narrative description of the property. And when I say narrative description of the property, I'm not talking about a quick little paragraph similar to what you might see in a real estate listing for a property, that it's a 2-story, gabled roof with a front porch. It's much more detailed than that. It is a systematic breakdown and description of the entire elevation, exterior of that property, each elevation, each side of that building, and then a full and complete description of the interior of that building, each floor and the layouts of those floors. So it is a very in-depth architectural description. Next attachment on that is going to be section 8, where you have to include a narrative statement of significance where you explain why that property is significant. When we talk about a statement of significance for a National Register nomination, yes, you're going to include, a chronological narrative, a story of that resource from before it existed to today, describing all of those key events and peoples and things related to its significance. But in a National Register nomination, it's not just that you have to be significant in your own right. It's not just about what happened in your site and individually in that location or that resource. It's how that resource then connects to the broader historic context. So when you're writing statements of significance for a National Register nomination, you're also going to include sections about related things. So for example, if you're writing a National Register nomination about a religious structure, a church. So you're going to have that history of that church and how it got built and all of the stories along its construction and use all throughout the years. But then you also need to tie that building into a broader context. So having information about that particular congregation or parish, having information about that particular denomination and their existence in your community. Were they in your community for a long time before they built that building? Are they new? And just explaining that significance. If you have key people associated with your resource, for instance, a notable architect who might have designed it, you're going to include a section describing who that architect is and why they may be significant in their own right and connect to a broader context. So again, the National Register nomination statement of significance isn't just a simple, straightforward history paper on your building. It's a much more detailed document explaining the building and how it fits into a broader pattern of history. And then those last two sections, section 9 is a bibliography where you cite, throughout your narrative, you're going to have footnotes or citations citing your sources, but then you also want to include a full bibliography. That's very, very important. These documents are, yes, nominating this resource to be listed on the National Register, but in its own right, once this document is completed, it is a research document for future researchers. So you want to make sure that all of the wonderful information that you've uncovered in your journey is then easily accessible, and that the next researcher can find those resources too, so that they're able to access that information first directly themselves. And then section 10 is boundary justifications, including maps and images to help explain that nomination. The next type of designation that exists is local landmarking. So the key thing about local landmarking is that you cannot have or nominate something to be a local landmark or a local historic district unless you have a local preservation ordinance on the books in your community. So you have to have a preservation law that allows you to create landmarks and historic districts before you can make those nominations. So again, make sure that your community is a community that has a local, has a preservation ordinance. When we're talking about local landmarking, it is an honorary designation that you are historic and are worthy of preservation and meet the various criteria that your law has. But with local landmarking in historic districts, it does come with that regulatory aspect. So now any exterior changes to that landmark building just needs to have that additional approval of that preservation board or commission. Because listing local landmarks and historic districts is very much particular to the law that we're looking at and to your community and what your law says that process is. So we can't really go into the nitty-gritty details of every community right now, but generally that process of local landmarking is going to start with an application, whatever your law says that application needs to look like, and that's going to be submitted to your Historic Preservation Commission or board, where they will then review that document, maybe doing additional information on their own or just taking your application as it is, And they will have a public hearing, and they will make a decision on whether or not that resource does meet the criteria and should be moved on for local landmarking. I think almost every community in Western New York has their law written where that Preservation Commission recommends that landmark nomination to their municipal legislative body. So if you're in the city of Buffalo, we're talking about that nomination going on to the Common Council. If you're in a town or village, it's going to move on to your town or village board or commissioners or whatever that word you have to describe your legislative body. And so then that legislative body is going to have their own review, public hearing and review of that nomination, and then make that final decision of whether or not to landmark that resource. Again, because the actual nitty gritty of the application process is going to be different depending on what community we're in and what that law requires that application to look like, or policies and procedures require that application to look like. But generally, best practices, this is what you want to have in your local landmark nomination that you send to your community. Most communities do have an application form. Here in the city of Buffalo, our application form is quite thin. It's just where you put in your name, you put in the name of the property, who owns that property, and do a couple of check boxes and fill in the blank questions, but that the bulk of the narrative and all the information about that building is requested on attachments as a separate document. But you have other communities like Amherst and Williamsville, Clarence, I believe as well, where your application form is where you do put in all that information. The application form is a sizable document where they do want you to write the history of it in that form and fill in that information on that application form. No matter what the application form is, whether it's a thin one or a larger one, it is great and best practices, a good practice to include your own narrative description of that property. Again, to make sure that the fruits of your labor, all of your research is articulated correctly, and that you are, confirming what that narrative history is of this property. So including a description of it, it doesn't necessarily need to be a big, huge description like we would have in a National Register nomination, but it is good practice to include a very basic, along the lines of what you would see in a real estate ad, just basic description of what the property looks like. And then again, a narrative history of the property so that your research, you did that research, you know it best, you can properly articulate what that history of that property is. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. All of your writings, no matter where they're going forward, it is so important to include citations, footnotes, and certainly a bibliography. Recently, we are working on a National Register nomination for a property here in the city of Buffalo. The architect involved, there's not really much written about that architect. And then we realized that there was a local landmark nomination that involved that architect. And so we went to that landmark nomination of that other building, had some great information in it, but unfortunately that document didn't have a very solid bibliography or citations. So we're actually kind of stuck now trying to figure out where did they get that information about that architect. So again, you have no idea who is going to read that narrative and that nomination that you've put together in the future. So making sure that you tell them and show your cards of where you got this information is incredibly important. And then again, you're going to include photos, maps, or other documents needed to, illustrate and confirm and highlight that narrative history, that history that you wrote about in your narrative. You don't need to include every single copy of what you've found. We're going to talk about city directory records. You could find a property in like 20 years worth of city directories. You're not going to put every copy of every city directory in this. You just want to do, the broad strokes, the major things, key photographs of the building over time, especially if your building has changed over time. So you can show visually that evolution of the site. And the same thing with maps to show how that individual building has changed, and certainly the location, the surroundings might have changed as well. And then any other documents that you think, based on the history of your building, based on this, all the details of your research, there might be other documents that you think need to be submitted, then by all means include those documents as well. All right, so that is my brief kind of rundown of those the different types of landmarking that exists and what those, basic understanding of what those nomination packages look like. So now we're going to move on to key resources. Again, put Q&A, anything you need in there for me, and Tia interrupt as necessary with any questions. All right, so we're going to talk about the key resources that we want to consult from here on out. First, it's 5 major types of resources that are, in my mind, absolutely necessary for you to consult. You might not get information from all of them, but you definitely want to try to consult all of these documents. Are there other documents that exist that can help and give information to your property? Yes. The reason for some of those documents that I'm not including on this list is that not all of them are actually accessible. The biggest example of that, of a document that really isn't that accessible here in Western New York, is tax assessment records. I haven't researched in all of our 5 counties yet, so it might be different in the counties that I haven't been able to really get into the nitty-gritties of how what documents are retained by the municipalities and by libraries and other institutions. But tax assessment records, I have found, have not been really a fruitful adventure here in Western New York. Other parts of New York State, that's usually my first thing that I check to see how the property has been assessed over the years. It's a great tool to mark and to try to identify when a property might have had alterations or additions, because you're going to see that clear jump in tax assessment values. But again, I've never really been able to find good sources and consistent sources for that type of information. So that's why I'm not including it tonight. So these are the big major sources that I know we can access here in Western New York and that you'll be successful in some way of getting. So that's why we're talking about them tonight. So first up is deeds, then maps, census data, city directories, and then newspapers and other types of publications. Let us go with deeds first. Excuse me. So deeds, obviously it's the document that marks the sale of a property. So with that deed, you're going to be able to at least create a chain of who owned the property over the years. And that's key so that you can then search other types of documents and identify. Owner is not necessarily the occupant of the property, but certainly we need that ownership and full title confirmation to be able to do and look at other types of documents. You're able to access deeds both online and in person. Here in Erie County, that in-person check is going to happen at the county clerk's office. In other counties, you'll still have the county clerk office have the main bulk of that data and of those documents, but depending on your municipality, some towns and villages have their own collection, their own copy of deed information as well, deed records. So depending on your community, you might also want to check with that actual municipality to see what they have on file versus what's being held by the county. Keep in mind when looking at deeds, it is not necessarily going to tell you how much the person paid for the property. More recent deeds of the modern era tend to not include that information or might just put $1 as the sale price. Older deeds will most likely have a sale price in that information, but again, not a guaranteed bit of information that you're going to find. It's also not going to tell you construction dates unless you find a magic deed that literally says includes a building that was built in 1925 on your deed. Otherwise, you're really not going to get any input or idea of construction date, because again, deed is selling the land, not necessarily the building on the land. It's going to get messy. It's probably going to get messy. You always, like that final bullet point is, you want to start from the back. You want to start from current day. You want to always work backwards. And so you want to do that because you want to make sure that you're following the right property and that you start with what you know and move farther away from what you currently know. And so depending on your property, you're definitely going to have messy situations. A lot of the example slides that, in the slides that we're going to see, I'm using the property that we own, 72 Sycamore, as an example. And I know from researching that property that there is a 10-year period of that where 672 Sycamore was sold back and forth between a wife and her husband, and then her second husband, about 45 million times. And it was the most complicated thing to follow because every time a deed happened, that the woman involved had a different last name when she was selling or buying it. So it was incredibly complicated to identify, is this the same woman? Is this the same property? So it can get messy. It can also get messy when you're talking about subdividing large plots of land. And that's why you always want to start with the present, because you know what your current lot dimensions are. And by going backwards, you can kind of check and confirm, are we staying with those same boundaries? Oh, is suddenly this deed now a larger boundary of land that was sold? So now you know that after that sale happened, oh, we must have divided this lot in half, and mine that I'm researching is this side, and there's another property on the other side that I don't need to follow. So again, it can get messy. Be prepared for that. When we're talking about just the general process of how to research deeds, again, you want to start with your most recent deed. If you own the property, obviously you are the owner. So you're going to start with the person you sold it from and trace those names backwards. So you'll look up that seller name to see who they bought the property from, and then keep going backwards and backwards. It can get kind of confusing because when you're getting into these books and into these documents, the words you're going to see are grantor and grantee. So the grantor is the seller of the property. The grantee is the purchaser of that property. So if you are the current owner, you're on your deed as the grantee, the person who sold it to you. Like in this little example box in the corner, John sold it to you, so he was the grantor. So now when you're going backwards to find out when John got it, you're going to be looking up him as a grantee, because that document you're looking for is when he purchased it, and so on and so forth, just going backwards. In searching deeds, and again, using Erie County as the example, but this is going to apply, the general process is going to apply for everyone. And I'm pretty sure that Tia has put into the chat box some links to the different counties' websites that will access these deeds. So every county does have some sort of computer database that you can access those documents on, whether it is through the tax assessment office, that's usually called a real property search, or through the actual clerk's office, where you can look up these registered filed deeds and other types of documents. When you're looking at the computer databases for these, especially when you're looking at the county clerk's websites, keep in mind that the most recent deeds, you're not going to be able to see images of those because of privacy concerns. They're going to hide that information for recent deeds, from the 1980s, 70s onward, because those deeds might have personal information, sensitive information, and those people are most likely still alive. So you're not going to be able to see more recent deeds. And then also for the older deeds that might be on those databases, they might be inventoried and in the system, but they didn't necessarily go back and find that 1800 deed and scan it and put it into their computer system. So you have that online virtual way to access that data. And then we have the physical in-person way, which are those other three documents. So you're going to have indexes at all of these county clerk's office, and the indexes are going to be separated by grantors and grantees, and then be grouped by year and then divided by an alphabetical order. So again, let's say I am, looking up a grantee. I know that, John Doe purchased a property in 1914, and I don't know who he bought it from. So I'm going to go to the grantee index that has deeds from 1914 to whatever, that book that has the 1914 deeds. And then I'm going to find the book that has John's last name in it. So Doe. So you're going to look up the D book, and you're going to find his name in that index, and then you'll be able to see who he bought that property from, who the grantor was, and then it'll reference the book and page where you can then go find that deed. And so then the same thing for grantor indexes. You'll have all of the grantor names indexed, grouped by year, and then listed alphabetically. So if you know that the seller of your property's last name was, Wilson, you're going to look to that year you think he sold the property, look up with the W book and find your grantor, see who they sold it to, and find that book and page to find the actual deed. And so then again, you're going to have a whole basement of Erie County Clerk's office filled with these deed books that will have the number of the book on the front. And then you have to open it up and flip to that page that they told you to go to, and you'll see copies of the deeds. In those books, those copies of deeds could be handwritten, regurgitation or summaries of what the original deed said, or they might actually be either handwritten or typed copies of that deed, where that original deed was, microfilmed and put into that book. All right, so if you're accessing deeds online, this is pretty much what those PDFs are going to look like, depending on your county and the system and all that. And again, trying to identify what are the parts of this deed, what do we need to know from this deed. This first section that's going to tell you, this indenture between that first person is going to be your grantor, and that second person is going to be your grantee. First is who's selling it, second is who's buying it. Then you're going to have a section that describes the lot description, the parcel. And so it'll usually start with this big grand phrase, all the tracts and parcels and land. It's going to then describe, the town and village and lot, and kind of zero in onto where we're talking about. And it's that word beginning. That's where your actual property description starts. And it tells you where you're physically starting and then measuring that lot out for you. Again, that's why you want to start with your most recent deed, because you know what your current boundaries of that property are. And you want to make sure that as you go backwards, you are still including and you're staying on that same boundary. And then if you're lucky, some deeds, if you're lucky, will include this section at the bottom that says being the same premise conveyed, and then will tell you the previous sale deed. It'll reference a previous deed. It might reference the most immediately previous deed, or it might reference a deed from a long time ago. I've seen that many times, especially when we're talking about properties that have complicated lot divisions and things like that. It might reference that way far back deed of the original big property that this was sectioned off of. So again, you might have the most immediate or a long time ago deed, but if you're lucky, you might have that. My experience is that not many deeds in Western New York have that paragraph referencing previous deeds. For better or worse, I don't exactly know why, but that's been my experience. So when you do find a deed that has the previous sale, oh my God, feel very special about it. Like I said before, when you're looking in those actual individual deed books to pull up that deed, once you found it in the indexes or you found it on the computer database and then going to look at it in person, the handwritten ones are going to look like this, where it's actually the book has printed form on it, and that person has handwritten in and filled in the blanks. So you see here, they've filled in the date, the names, and have added in that description of the property. And in trying to decipher what is on this page right now, the top number at the top of the page is going to be the book number. It's also on the outside of the book, page number in the top corner. Again, that first name that's going to be mentioned, or first several names that are mentioned, because there might be multiple people who are owning it and selling that, is going to be your grantor. That last part is going to be your grantee. And again, when you were talking about these handwritten deeds, we're talking about older deeds. And so there is more of a likelihood that you'll see an actual number listed for that sale price. Or you might open up that deed book and it's going to look something like this, where it's either a microfilmed, copy of a typed up a deed like you see here in front of you, or it might be a microfilmed handwritten deed if you're looking at really, really old ones. But that's what this will look like. It's a little bit clearer because it's typed up who the grantor is and who the grantee is. And then the same thing with that description and the text of that deed. You want to keep an eye out for the word beginning, because that's going to be the start of your description of the plot lines. And then you want to keep track of, this deed did have a reference to a previous. So we see right here, being the same premises described in a certain deed going backwards. So that's how that's going to look in a typewritten one. When I talk about the real property searches, here is what the Erie County's real property search is going to look like. It also looks similar to this in a couple of other counties if you're going to use this resource. So this real property search is through the tax assessment office. So the point of this information isn't necessarily to give you deed information. It's to confirm this property and its tax rate in, its the SBL, like the tax, the lot number of that property, but you can still get owner information and deed information from this website. So here you can see I typed in 72 Sycamore to that in that search box, and then I got this square comes up on the next screen. And so we can see that it references that it says the owner is right here, Sycamore Street Development LLC, and that purchase was in deed book that number and deed page that number. But don't ever just leave it there. You always want to then click that owner history button at the bottom, because oftentimes the owner and deed information that you see on this front page is actually not the most recent information. There's kind of a delay in their system, and sometimes this page doesn't get updated. So when you click that owner information button, we can actually see that there is a more recent deed, that yes, Sycamore Street previously owned it, but just recently in 2020, 72 Sycamore Preservation LLC purchased it. That's us. And so now that is the actual current owner. So again, you want to get that deed book and page number and have that in your resources. So again, if you're using the real property page to get this deed information, make sure to check the owner history. And then you see it includes deeds going all the way back to 1952. You know, depending on your property and how many times it's been sold, you might even have a reference to an even older date sale, deed, or it might just literally have the most recent deed because that person has owned it for so long before that it's not, the older deed isn't even in the system. So again, it just gives you kind of an intro basic information about the deeds because it's through the tax assessment office. Where you actually get the deeds documents and the full information about property sales is going to be through the actual clerk's website. And so here is what the Erie County website looks like. And as I said, and as you guys saw in the chat, Tia shared links to other counties' websites. Erie County created their own system, and it's their own, they hired someone to do it because you can see the copyright thing at the bottom, but this system is their own. Whereas the other counties have, have an outside consultant come in, and they're using an outside system to do that work. And so you can see on those links, if you are in those counties, many of Niagara, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and Allegheny, their systems, you have to pay to access those documents. Here in Erie County, it is free and available to anyone who accesses this website. Unfortunately, for those other counties, they do require payment to access those online databases. I think it's $15 for half an hour, or you can buy a subscription plan. So it's not really cheap, but again, if you know what you're looking for and can spend half an hour researching, the $15 would probably be worth it for you. So again, in this system on Erie County, if you're looking up a specific deed, you know the book and page number, you can go on that tab, put your book and page number, and then here is the key information about that deed. And as I said in the beginning, more recent deeds on these online databases through your clerk's office, you're likely not going to be able to see the image. And you can see here, it's kind of cut off for the presentation, but what it fully says here is that image for this is temporarily unavailable because it's so recent that they're hiding and protecting that personal information that might be in that deed. All right, so that is deeds. Questions about deed work? I'm going to take a drink while you ponder your typing. And again, I don't have the capability to unmute anybody to talk, so you really do need to type in your questions in the Q&A or the chat. All right, so we are going to move on to maps now. If you still have questions about deeds, don't worry about it. Put it in the Q&A and we'll catch them later, okay? So when it comes to maps, there's going to be a large variety of maps that are available. There are Sanborn maps. Those are Sanborn fire insurance maps that will give you a lot of detailed, wonderful information. There is a wide variety of various city and town and village atlases that were either commissioned and created by municipalities themselves or outside individuals. A lot of individual survey maps that you can find through your respective clerk's offices or libraries or historical societies. And we're going to be able to find maps online and physically in libraries. So it really depends on your location, the municipality that you're researching on, as far as which of these maps and how many and what kinds of these maps are going to be available to you. So again, starting with Sanborn Maps, they are fire insurance maps. So they are created by a separate company for the insurance purposes so that they can have an accurate inventory of the buildings in that community, that we know what the materials are for that resource, and that for fire insurance purposes. They can have that documentation. So there's going to be Sanborn Maps for almost every community that has enough built-in fire environment that would warrant the company to spend the time to make that map. So for our bigger cities, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Jamestown, Dunkirk, Olean, you're going to have Sanborn Maps for many, many years, over several decades. But for smaller communities, for our villages and towns, you might only have 1 or 2 years where you find a Sanborn map. And even then, the Sanborn map might not be the whole entire municipality. It might just be that commercial main drag. So for example, in Williamsville and in Amherst area, the Sanborn maps for there don't show the whole entire town or village. It just shows the portions of Main Street that have tons of buildings on them, or other key main drag areas. To access Sanborn Maps, for those of you in Erie County and for those of you who have Erie County library cards, they're free. I highly encourage you to go get a library card if you don't already have one. With your library card, a perk of the card is that you have access to the Sanborn Map database. And so how you access that through the website is you go to the library's website, to their database A through Z index, which I think Tia is going to share the link with you guys. You have to put your library card number in the top, in this login box in the top of the page. You put your library card number in, just the barcode from the back, hit login, and then it'll allow you to access all of those databases that are listed. Definitely take some time and look through them. There are many, many random databases and all different types of topics, not just history things. There's other types of resources that you have access free through your library card. So definitely explore those options. But what you're going to look for is in the S, which is the Sanborn Maps of New York. And when you click on that link, it's going to take you to a page that looks like this. When you click that Browse and Explore button, it's going to bring you to a page where you get to select the state that you want to look at, the city, and then the year of the Sanborn map that you want to look at. Our Sanborn map access is expensive. That was one of the saddest things about leaving grad school and losing my student library privileges, was because that was how I was accessing Sanborn maps for many years. And it's expensive and difficult to access them digitally if you aren't associated with a library or university that would give you that access. So it's incredibly wonderful that our library card gives us that access. But because of that subscription, we only can access New York State Sanborn maps when you're using your Buffalo library card to access them. So you're going to pull up Buffalo or any other community in Erie County that have Sanborn maps, and then you'll be able to select from the available dates. Again, not all communities have Sanborn maps for every year. And then depending on what year you pick up, you'll get this results page where you can literally navigate through these images, through the map images. You can access this through the library's website, but at the actual library in the Grosvenor's room, you have the physical copies of all of these maps. Obviously the pandemic, they've shortened their, they had been shortening their hours. Now they are full-time, open, and you can go in there to look at those documents. Why would you want to look at the in-person versus the online? As you saw on the previous slide, Drew. This is what the actual printed Sanborn maps look like. They are beautifully illustrated and colored because they're color coded for the material of those buildings. So when you're looking at the individual lots, they're going to be pink if they're brick, they're going to be blue if they're concrete, yellow if they're wood. And here online, it's just going to be those colorless scans. You'll still get all the same information you need, but looking at the real ones is a little bit funner. So the public library here in Erie County has those. The Library of Congress also has access in their online database to some Sanborn maps. Even since the pandemic started, I've noticed that they've increased, that they've kind of done a lot of scanning and on their end. So there are way more Sanborn maps available through the Library of Congress than there previously were. And the best part about the ones that are accessible through the Library of Congress is that I think all of them are in color. So you'll be able to use, if you're in Erie County, be able to use this website website to just get the page and number and find your property, but then you could go to the Library of Congress's version and be able to get that colored, the highlighted copy of it. Other maps that exist. Again, kind of focusing first on Erie County as an example, the Buffalo History Museum has done a wonderful job for us and has actually made an inventory of the atlases in their collection. And for the most part, the atlases that they have in their collection represent a vast majority of the atlases that are available. And again, they're going to have maps that are for the city of Buffalo and for the whole county. So that is a great resource to check first and foremost. There's also a website called buffaloresearch.com that's actually run by the head librarian at the Buffalo History Museum, Cynthia Van Ness, where she has gone above and beyond that and has included much more research and information on that website. So you'll be able to find access to those the Erie, the Buffalo and Erie County atlases through those sources. When we're talking about other communities, you're definitely going to check with either, if you're in a city or a town, your local historical society, if they have a library, or maybe it's the public library that has that local history room. You're going to go to those places to see what maps they have available. I know for a fact that in Niagara Falls, the Niagara Falls Public Library, in their local history room, they have all the Sanborn maps for Niagara Falls. They have many copies of Niagara Falls atlases and maps other than Sanborn's, and then some into the county as well. And so then again, if you're in some of those smaller towns and villages, heading to your village or town hall first to see what they may have, your local library branch to see what they may have, and then your local historical society as well. All right, so that is mapping. Any questions for mapping? I see lots of comments and things happening, so.
Lots of questions. Okay.
What are some questions?
We'll go with, are Sanborn maps still created first for our first question?
I honestly have no idea the answer to that question. I don't think they are. The last one that you're going to be able to find on the county's website, what's happening here? On the through your library card, see how it says date here? That most recent one for the city of Buffalo is going to be one that's dated 1925, updated in 1940. I don't think, I've never seen a Sanborn from later than that. So either they don't exist or we don't have access to them. I've never actually wondered that question. I'm sorry.
Okay, and our second Sanborn map question is, will a Sanborn map show the data of construction?
No, it's not going to show you on that map the date of construction. How Sanborn maps may help in pinpointing and narrowing down what your construction date is by looking at all of those available and being able to create a timeline, a map timeline of that property. So again, you might look at, here is the 1889, 1893 Buffalo Sanborn. You might look up your street and you can't find your house, but the next one that's from 1900 has your house. So you at least know it was constructed in that time period, but it's not going to specifically say its construction date. What it will give you is little notations, and you have to go to that front page and the key that is at the beginning of the map, but there's little tiny notations that are on that map. So you'll see sometimes there'll be solid circles like dots on buildings. There'll be hatch marks on it, and all those things mean things. They'll be either telling you that building has a flat roof or a gabled roof. Again, the color coding in the print, the real hard copies, is going to tell you what the material of that building is. So again, if you're unsure if the building you have now on that site is the original, looking at a former Sanborn map and the building you're looking at now is a brick building, but you have a wood frame building on that site in the 1800s, well, you know that wood frame has been gone and it was replaced with this brick building. So it'll give you that kind of information, but not straight up the construction date.
Okay, and Marcia asked, what personal info is shown by a photo of a building?
I don't know if I understand that question, Marcia, but it's always great to try to find photographs of your building, because again, used in conjunction with that mapping, it'll be able to help you figure out when different alterations and additions might have happened. So you'll have your maps tell you, you think this addition or this change in the building happened in this time period. So if you have photographs from that time period, it'll again help you whittle down and identify when those exact changes happened.
Okay, and then we had one question about NR nominations, but do you want to save that until the end?
Yeah, let's hold on to that to the end.
All right, let's continue then.
All right, so next on to, thank you, Tia. Next on to city directories. It's super important, we just call them city directories. Obviously, towns and villages will have directories as well, over, and call them different words maybe. But you're going to have some sort of index of residents or businesses for every community. But again, depending on your municipality, the type of municipality it is, city, town, village, whatever, that directory is going to look different, and the type of information included in that directory is going to be different. So major example is going to be City of Buffalo, City of Niagara Falls, Jamestown, Olean, Dunkirk, Fredonia. You're going to see city directories that give you a listing of every resident in that community, or at least an attempt at giving you every resident in that community. Where most likely when you're talking about village or town directories, and especially for those directories in the 19th century and earlier, those directories are going to be just commercial directories. You don't often find a village or town directory that lists every person who lives in that town or village. It's just going to be the commercial entities that you want to access in that village. But again, it depends on your community. You need to check those resources to see what information it is going to have. But overall, in general, when you're talking about these directories, it's going to give you a resident name. So it's going to give you the names of people who live there, businesses that occupy those spaces, the address, whether it's the business address or a home address, and then for later on in the 20th century, you'll also start getting phone numbers. Again, you see this evolution of city directories into phone books, where the point is no longer really trying to tell you where everyone is and to be able to find those people, but really just so that you can use your phone and call people. So when you go into that era where they start turning into phone books, if you don't find people in that, it's not necessarily that they aren't living there or aren't in that property. It could just be they don't have a phone, or they've asked to be unlisted. I think we all remember those days. I mean, I know they still make phone books, but I don't think we actually talk about them as much as we used to. So again, when you get into the more recent directories and phone books, just if someone isn't listed, it doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't there. For older directories, those documents might also include information about that person's occupation or their employer. It might list their business address in addition to a residential address. And especially for women, it's going to reference marital status, because why not? So when you're looking up women in city or village directories, there's going to be a certain time period where you're not even going to see single women listed at all. And then it merges into, you will see single women, but it's only going to be single women who are listed as widows, or they are married, or if, there's not really often just single regular women being listed in city directories from the 1800s and earlier. So again, being mindful of who it is that you're actually looking up is important. And again, if you're looking up a residential property, when you look up the city directory, it's only going to tell you who that homeowner is, who that head of household is. So if it might just have the father, the dad, the husband is listed. It's not going to necessarily list the wife and the children. It might list the wife and the children if they have their own reasons for being listed. You often see adult and teenage boys being listed because they might have started working on their own. So then they warrant their own listing. But housewives, single women living in households with other family members, you're not going to see their names listed. And so, yeah, that's what I got to say about that. To be able to access city directories, again, depending on your community, you might be able to access online, but for the most part, how you're going to access this data is in person by going to your library, to the historical society, whatever that repository is that has those books, so that you can go through them. There are a few of our communities that are spoiled and we can find these documents online. City of Buffalo is one of them. The Erie County, the public library partnered with New York Heritage to provide access to every city directory from 1832 to 1913 through this website. And so Tia is going to share that link. It's written on the screen as well. To search this website, you can use the search bar that you see right here on the screen. You can type in those words that you want. My coworker likes to do it, or usually does it that way. And so when you type in, for example, here is the result screen that you'll see if you typed in 72 Sycamore. So it's going to list you, it's 53 records, 53 city directories found 72 Sycamore in those books. So then you can click which city directory you want to look at and then be able to search those. I personally, because this system it is a great system. It's not wonky or weird. It's a very good search platform, technically speaking. But because we're talking about, it's reading the letters on the scanned book, I think that there's a lot more opportunity to have misspellings and misunderstandings in that text recognition. So I personally don't like to use the main search bar. I like to just click where it says explore collection, and it'll bring you where you can see every single book. And I just select the year I want to look at, and I search each individual book myself. And so here's what that might look like. So you clicked explore the collection. I selected the 1854 directory and I searched for 72 Sycamore. And so when you search that, you click that filtered button and it's just going to give you the pages that have that on it. But it's really important to understand with this system, it's not going to be, if you put question marks around that search term, it's not going to search 72 Sycamore right next to each other. That's not how this program works. So when you type in 72 Sycamore, what it's searching for is a page that has the word Sycamore and the number 72. So it's not necessarily that it's 72 Sycamore. It's just that both of those words are on the same page. And so you have to manually click all of those pages to see, is it 72 Sycamore, or is it, like on this case, a sycamore at the top of the page and at the bottom of the page, there's a number 72. The other thing when you're searching these Buffalo City directories on this website is to pay attention to abbreviations. Depending on, this document, this city directory is really early, and you can see that there's a lot of empty space on that page. So for this year and the ones around this year, you're most likely going to have the words written out fully because there is that space on the page. But as you get into more, older, more recent ones into the 1880s, 90s, and further, you're going to have abbreviations. So you might have a line where the person has a really long name, and by the time, and they write the other information that needs to be there, and by the time they want to list home 72 Sycamore, there might not be enough character space. So they might write H period 72 and then sick, or some other abbreviation of Sycamore. When I've been researching, our properties on Sycamore and the Michigan corridor for quite some time now, and there's a variety of ways. Even in one city directory, there is not consistency in how they do the abbreviations. It's really dependent on that line and how many characters they have left. So again, you want to do that full word search so that you can find the full clear listings. But in this website, you might also want to explore searching abbreviated versions of those words. Again, depending on the street that you're talking about, depending on what you're searching. Because again, how they're doing the search is that it's character recognition. 72 Sycamore was built and owned by Eliza Quirk with a Q. Q's are weird letters, and depending on the typeface that's being used, that scanner is going to read that Q differently. It might read it as a Q, but it might read it as a 0 or an O. So again, depending on what you're searching and the letters involved and all of that, you want to, use a variety of search terms to make sure that you're catching all of those references that you want to catch. There is another way that you can search directories for everybody else. If there is, well, not everyone else, for anyone else in the county, again, another perk of your library card is that you have access to Heritage Quest and Ancestry.com. It's going to be limited. You won't have full range access because there are still some things that are going to be behind a paywall. But you can, with your library card, do remedial basic searches and access actual original documents. So Heritage Quest through your library card is where you're going to be able to access city directories. And again, it's going to be city directories for anywhere in the country that you'll be able to search. And so when you click on that city directory, you'll find this search bar that looks like this. You type in the names or whatever information you have to be able to search. And so here you can see a sample search results where I've put in Eliza, Clerk, and Buffalo. And so here are all the city directories that they have from 1822 to 1995 that meet those search parameters that I put in there. So this is what it's going to look like. You can click that view record, and then you'll be able to go and access that actual page that will be included in the library membership. So that's a way that you can do that. Again, really useful for those of you out in the out in the county, not in the city of Buffalo, because there isn't a nice clean place for you to go and get all the village directories for your community. So this is going to be one of those major ways for you to be able to find them. When it comes to city directories, also keep in mind Google Books. That has continuously, every time I search Google Books, I find more and more things in there. More and more libraries are providing access to their collections. So always stop there and check. At the end of the presentation, I'm also going to have a slide with a lot of other websites like Google Books and a lot of other random internet repositories that may have city directories, it may have maps, it may have other types of publications. So we'll talk about more of those sites at the end. So that is what I got to say about city directories. Any questions about those before we move on to census data? It is so hot in this room that I'm in right now. I might melt by the end of this presentation. And I'm trying to talk as fast as I can, but I already talk quite fast. So I don't know if I'm going to survive. All right. So if there are no questions about directories, we'll move on to census records. Census records, you're going to have here in New York State, you're going to have the federal census records and New York State census records. So the federal census is going to happen every 10 years on the 0 year. So 1850, 1860, 1870. And you're going to be able to access census data from the beginning of census data. 1790 was the first census, all the way through 1940 right now. In 2022, the federal government is going to open up access to the 1950 census records. Census records from 1940 right now to the present are not available to the public because it is sensitive data information about people who are alive. So they have a release schedule of when they're going to release each census data. And so we're coming up on that newest one next year when they'll release access to 1950s. In New York State, we also have the census done every 10 years, but it's going to be done on the 5 years. So it's really great to be able to look up, for example, your 1850 federal census, and then 5 years later to be able to look at that 1855 census. The federal census every year is going to tweak the questions they ask a little bit, but pretty much those questions are standard, are going to continue throughout all of those federal census. The New York State census is being done for New York State's edification for their own reasons. So the questions are going to overlap sometimes. Are going to overlap with some of the questions on the federal census, but the New York State census has other questions that they ask. And so it is really good if you can to try to consult both of them, because you're going to get different type of information about the household you're looking up, depending on which census that you get. And the last available census that exists is 1925. You can go to your public library, whether it's the Erie County Public Library, Niagara Falls, I know has it, and be able to look at census data, or in a historical society, if they have census data in their collection. Many places have the microfilmed copies of census data, so that you can go there and navigate that paperwork. But the easiest way is to do it online. And again, if you have an Erie County Library card, you have access to Heritage Quest and also Ancestry.com to be able to use their records for census data. So it is quite easy to just get in there and navigate all of their census data. And again, it's not going to limit you to your community that you are physically in. If you're looking at the census data on microfilm at your library or historical society, they're just going to have the census data for your community. Whereas going on Heritage Quest or Ancestry, you'll be able to search anywhere, pretty much. So again, it's all the, I mean, I'm pretty sure Heritage Quest and Ancestry.com are actually ultimately owned by the same company. And so their search capabilities are basically the same, but it's going to look similar to that other screenshot I sent you. A search window will come in, you type in what information you have, and then try to find people in those census data. New York State census records, there used to be a very quick and easy way to access the census data on the state library's website. But in the last year or two, they've made some major changes to their website, or not major changes, but have kind of reorganized a few pages. And I have had the biggest difficulty trying to find census data and access those files that I know that I used to be able to get. I just can't seem to find it anymore. So that was really frustrating for a while. But then FamilySearch.org came up. FamilySearch.org is another one of those genealogy sites that exist, that is owned by the Mormons. And so through their website, you are able to access all of the available New York State census documents. There was a census done before 1855. There's a missing New York State census. I can't remember what year it is now, actually. But in 1901 or 1911, the state capitol burned down, and the state library was in the capitol at the time. And so that was the only original copy of that particular census. So there is one that's missing, but everything that you can access for the New York State Census is here on this website. You do need to make a login to be able to access this website. So you do need to create an account, but you should have no problem navigating all of these documents. I have for free. I've never paid them any money, and I've been able to access all of them. So you shouldn't have too big of a problem going on there. And again, Tia can share, because it's a weird long link with lots of percent marks in it. So Tia can share that link in the chat box. When we're talking about looking at census data, it is really important, and partly why I have it listed as 4 on my list. It's really helps you to go into census research when you've done a lot of existing research on the property, that you know a lot about that document, about that resource, and the names involved in the actual resource you're looking up, and the neighboring houses. Because it's important to understand that census data, whether the federal or the New York State, is not organized by house and street number. You can't look up in the census and say, where's 72 Sycamore? Later census documents, when we get into the 1900s, 1920s, 30s, into the 20th century, they do start adding street labels, and they do start entering them in as the actual house number and street. But again, your house number and street could change, so that might not always be consistent in its own right. But for all those earlier census data, it's not going to reference your street at all. It's going to be organized by ward. So every community is going to be divided by ward. At the beginning of your census package for that year, it'll have a ward map that tells you where the boundaries are, so you can then go to that appropriate ward and try to find your person in that ward. If you're using an online database, you don't need to do that. You can just search by name and it'll do that legwork for you. But if you're looking at it in person, knowing your ward number is important. But again, here you can see on this page, this is a 1850 census, I think it was, where we found Eliza Quirk, and there's her name right there with the red arrow. And you can see these 2 numbers next to her name. And those 2 numbers relate to the house number, the building number, and then the household number. And so what that means is that as that census worker has been going down the street or wherever they are in that ward, the first building they go to is building number 1. The next building they go to is building number 2. So it is just a chronological inventory accounting of all the buildings that that person went to, not necessarily that they are all in a row or on the same street or whatnot. It's just an internal counting so they know how many buildings are in that ward. And then that second number, household number, is that it's the next household. So again, that census worker went to building number 1, and that building had 4 different families living in it. So it's going to be 1 number 1, 1 number 2, 1 number 3. And so then when they go to that second building, that first household that they have in that second building is going to be the next number continuation. So it'll be number 4, number 5, number 6, whatever. So that's what these numbers are here. So again, we didn't find Eliza in the census data because it was organized by her address. We just found her by that word search on the internet. So why is it important to go into this and knowing neighbor names and other names that might be living in that property? Because while you may know the owner, because you've already done your deed research, so you know the owner name that you might be looking for, but maybe the owner isn't occupying that building. Maybe when this census was done, that property was being rented out, or maybe the property was never occupied by that owner. It's a fully commercial building. So you're never going to see that owner name listed there. It's always going to be the renters that are occupying that space because they live there. And so they're the ones that are going to fill out the census data for it. So again, knowing who your owner is and who is the occupant is really important. And you need to have that kind of an idea of who those people are before you even try to search for census data. Knowing who are the owners and all the other possible names that you might encounter will also help you. So here, to explain this coloring that's on here, we found Eliza Quirk in this city directory, saw her name, and we saw all of her lovely ladies that lived in her house and worked at her house listed below her. And that's what we thought was happening with this document. But under further investigation and analysis, we can identify and see all of the other property owners and occupants surrounding her. So based on that, we can tell that this census worker actually did go right in order. Went to her neighbor on the east side, Henry Nichols, first. Then they went to her other unit in the building she owned, which was listed and inventoried here under as Cynthia McDaniels. So we have Cynthia McDaniels occupying that rental unit that Eliza owned in her building. Then we have Eliza's unit and her lovely ladies, and then we have the next door owners. So because we knew who Henry Nichol was, we knew who Joseph Staub was, we were able to realize that actually all of those women highlighted in yellow were living in that one building. Where if we didn't have that other information, we didn't do that analysis, we would have thought that it was just the women, Eliza and the women listed under her, who were actually living in that building. Okay, that is census data. Questions about census records? Awesome sauce. In regards to building information, again, census data is going to tell you who's occupying it and their connections to each other. In this case, Eliza operated a brothel out of the building. So all of these women are listed here. They have no occupations and they have no familiar relationships to each other listed. But if they were families, they would list, it doesn't do it in this document, but in other census records, if we look down here to the blue area where Joseph Staub is, he's listed as a shoemaker because that was his job. Normally you'd see for his wife, it would say wife, and it would say child, son, daughter, for describing with a connection to those other people. So in other years, you're going to see that kind of information, documenting what is the relationship with the people occupying that building. The other thing related to building information that the census data is going to tell you is in this column right here, the header is cut off, but it's going to give you, if they are the head of household, they're going to give you either an estimated value of the property or maybe their personal value. So again, depending on your resource, depending on the story of your property, that number might help you identify, is the building I'm thinking of that building on site? If there's drastic changes in the value listed on one census to the next census, maybe they'd had an addition that year. So again, that value might help you figure out some details about that property. All right. Questions about census before we talk about newspapers and other publications? I'm going to take one more water.
We do have a question.
Yes.
Mary says, how did I not know there was a New York State Census? Do
Yeah.
other states have these?
I would think that other states have census records, their own censuses. I've personally never researched them directly, but I can't imagine that they wouldn't have census data, especially when you're looking at other states and depending on what time period we're talking about. If we're talking about southern states pre-Civil War, I know that there are inventories of enslaved people and of their owners. So there are, variety of different inventory type documents that exist. But yeah, I mean, other states must have census data. I don't know exactly how to access them though. And again, like I said, it's been like an ordeal to access the New York State ones. So now that I have that link, I hope we don't all rush on it and then the Mormons get mad and make us start paying for it.
And Thomas says, how did you know the address has changed and that's Sycamore Street?
Mm-hmm. So again, depending on your community and depending on the different repositories that you can access to get that information. For example, here in the city of Buffalo, there's been lots of researchers, private researchers, and the public library where they've actually created a document that gives you a cheat sheet of the street index. So the public library has a resource. You can get it online through their website. I'm not exactly sure where to click to get that because the public library did recently change their website over the pandemic. So some of the old links that I have bookmarked no longer work. But if you go into the Grosvenor's room at the main library, they have all these research guides printed out. And so one of those is an index of all the streets and the name changes. And again, buffaloresearch.com. And there's a couple of other like Buffalo-centric websites that exist that document and explain the changes in street names. For other smaller communities, you're going to have to just rely on those maps. And that's why you want to do your mapping, your deeds and your mapping first, because the deed is going to give you that name list of the key people that you know are going to be associated with the property that you can keep an eyeball out for. And then your mapping is going to give you that house number. So when you look at those maps, whether they're Sanborn maps or atlases, very frequently, very often data that you'll find on that map is also a listing of the street number, the house number. It'll be just a little number written next to it. So again, when you have that full collection of all the maps available from all the time periods of your property, you'll be able to see, has the street changed? Has that number changed? In the city of Buffalo, the major renumber, there's little renumberings that happen here and there, obviously, but in oh Lord, I'm going to forget the year right now that I'm going to tell you, 1865, 1855. There is a major renumbering where pretty much every street every street in Buffalo had an adjustment to their numbering, especially downtown Buffalo area. So that's when we see, our 72 Sycamore used to be 50 Sycamore. And so in the 1860 numbering project that happened, that's when we get the current number. In the city of Buffalo, there's really been no major changes to house numbers since the 1870s, 1860s. They restarted because the city was growing so big that we had expanded to our current dimensions. So they did that number so they could be set on the right path for the future. But again, that's why it's super important to check all those mappings first. All good on questions? I think so. So I will move on to newspapers and other publications. So when it comes to newspapers and other publications, obviously looking at, newspapers themselves for any notes, articles that involve your property, involve the people involved in your property, and just, going to town and keyword searching all of those different entities and things that relate to your property. Again, depending on your property and the type of resource it is and the history associated with it, you're going to be more successful and find lots of things or maybe not find many things. So if we're talking about a private residence and you're keyword searching the address and the owner is just a regular human, they didn't have a public office, they never had a fire in the house, they never were, any sort of thing happened, happen that would require a newspaper article about them, you might not find many mentions of your address. I think the vast majority, when in the city of Buffalo, especially when I'm putting in addresses and trying to search for an address mention, the most of what I come up with is going to be, especially in the early 20th century and into the 19th century, notes, ads for looking for housekeepers or other types of helps staff, or advertisements for selling things. They're selling a car, they're selling a radio. So you'll see advertisements for those people posting whatever ads that they're posting. That's the majority of what you're going to find for just regular homes occupied by regular people. But again, if you have a more prominent public building that you're searching, or your property involves somebody who might be listed in the newspaper, then you're going to be finding things that relate to that. One of the fun little things that you see often, especially in the 1900s through today, when you're keyword searching either addresses or individuals' names, are, especially when it comes to women. So we might not see the wives and daughters reflected in other documents that we're talking about. We're not going to see them in the city directories. We're obviously not going to see them on deeds or any official documents because they don't actually own the property. It's the man that owns the property. But in the newspaper, there's women's society pages. There are dozens and dozens of clubs and organizations that women are going to be occupying and working in. And so you do often see those listings and mention of the women and the clubs they're in, and the luncheons and the teas and the fundraisers that they are hosting at their houses for their fellow members. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye out, especially when you're researching a residential resource, your house or someone else's house. And the other thing when you're researching residences, especially in a city, so this might not necessarily apply to the villages and towns because your rules about permitting is going to be different. But for the city, there used to be a steady column in all city newspapers that listed out the permits that were issued by the city for that day or the week or whatnot. So again, depending on what city you're in, what time period we're talking about, you might find a listing of that the permit for your house to be built had been issued. And just with the city directory advice that I gave about the keyword searching, depending on the website that you're going to look for these newspapers and other publications, again, you want to diversify your search terms. Not every time that house is mentioned in newspapers or publications is it going to be listed as 72 Sycamore Street. It's going to be abbreviated. It might not even have the number. It might just say Sycamore and a person's name. So again, really kind of twisting your brain to explore all the different ways that you can compile and change up those search terms so that you are finding the things that you want to find. We are blessed in New York. I mean, anyone can access this because it's on the internet. But FultonHistory.com is a glorious website set up by Mr. Thomas Trininsky in Fulton, New York. He, from his stories and the information that he puts out there, he used to work at IBM. He retired, and in his retirement, he has crazy high-powered scanners, and he scans old newspapers so that people have access to them. This is a fabulous website. It is definitely Intranet 1995. It is very fickle in its search. It's very powerful and will definitely give you lots of results, depending on your information that you're looking for. If there are articles to be found, you're going to get a lot of them. But again, really play around with that search bar and explore the different terms to use, but also playing around with the use of quotations for keyword searching and things like that. So it definitely takes a minute to get used to this website and really perfecting how you search on it. I mean, I think I'm constantly learning tricks to be able to produce better search results on this website, but it is very good. And then again, it's a high quality scan. So you're going to keyword search that millions of pieces of newspapers that he scanned, be able to open that page and then be able to download that whole entire high res copy of that newspaper page. It's an incredibly useful source. Looking more conventional sources created by more established organizations and not just this lovely dude who wants people to have access to history. We have newspapers.com. Obviously, you can do some searching for free on their website without without registering, but really you do need to have an account to be able to fully access articles and newspapers on that search. I know that I don't think that currently the public library gives you access to newspapers.com. I could be wrong, but you can access newspapers.com when you're in the library search room at the Buffalo History Museum. And actually, they have an agreement, contract working with newspapers.com where they are scanning parts of the History Museum's collection of newspapers. And so in that agreement, there are those newspapers that are not accessible to the public that are only going to be accessible in that search room for a certain period of time. So it is advantageous, even if you have an account, to go to the history museums because you're going to be able to access a little bit more copies of local newspapers than you might be able to access at home with your just regular account. Another source for newspapers is the New York State Historic Newspaper Database. So there was a huge project that was done previously to try to inventory and scan all of the small little newspapers in New York State. This project is officially over. They're not actively trying to add to the collection, but it's still able to access and search that collection. And so you can do it by county, you can do it by individual newspaper. It's a little bit more remedial of a search interface than newspapers.com, but it is really great and you still get really high quality scans as a result of that search. And then again, as I said previously, there are a variety of websites out there that have not only, newspaper records, but all sorts of publications that have been printed, things that have just gone on in the world. And these repositories have found them, scanned them, and made them available to the public. And so these are kind of my big places to definitely check and keyword search for your community, for your address, for any names involved in your property. So the New York Historical Society is the New York City Historical Society, but they have a large digital collection. And again, excuse me, depending on the property you're researching, depending on its history, there might be a reason that they might have documents in their collection that are relate to you. Because even though they are focused on New York City, they have things that relate to New York State history as well. It's all connected. So they have a lot of great resources in there. I'm pretty sure that they actually also have copies of New York State Census data records. So that's one other place that you can go to. Library of Congress. I mean, the things they have, we can't even, sit here and actually explain all of the things that they have. But you'll have access to the Library of Congress to whether it's photographs, architectural drawings, those Sanborn maps. There's just so many different types of things that could come up when you search their digital records. New York Heritage digital collections that you see on the bottom there. We talked about how they house the city directory records for the city of Buffalo, but they have tons of other things in their collection as well. So again, keyword searching, navigating there and exploring their collection is definitely worth it. Google Books, again, every day more and more things are added to the Google universe. HathiTrust and the Internet Archive are, again, other types of online libraries that collect data. Internet Archive is going to be, as the name says, an archive of all things that they can collect and find on the internet, whereas HathiTrust Digital Library is much more connected with actual institutions, actual brick and mortar libraries, and connecting you to their digital collections and having a way to access those resources. So, HathiTrust to me is kind of, as the subtitle says, it's really just like a digital library that lets you access all of these separate repositories on their own. Again, there are many, many websites out there with lots of different information, tons of libraries in this country. And again, just because the library is here in this geographic area doesn't mean that they might not have information about other communities. For example, there's a very prominent architectural library in Chicago. And yes, it has tons of information about the buildings in Chicago, but because it was such a center of architecture, They have tons of records about lots of buildings around the country. You know, the architects associated with Chicago might have also worked in other communities and things like that. And they might have just collected things over the years and they just have it part of their collection now. So, this institution that I'm thinking of, the name is escaping me right now, but I know that they have a lot of stuff about our city hall, documents that I can't access at any repository here in the city of Buffalo, but that library in Chicago has it. But thankfully they had them available on their website. And the same for any sort of university or library that has digital collections. Again, you never know, really getting into the weeds on Google searching and all the ways that you can to kind of pull up all these little weird sources that you could access. And with that, I think that's my last slide. Those are all of the key resources that you should consult. Fire away with more questions. Before we get into those questions, we'll answer all the questions and we'll be here. We have another 20 minutes on the books for this session. For those of you who don't have any questions or might need to leave for another engagement, thank you so much for being here tonight. Again, I said at the start of the show that we are recording this program, so it will be available on our YouTube page probably tomorrow or maybe at the end of the week, but you'll be able to find that to access that again. Tia's been sharing those links in the chat for the various websites and sources that I've mentioned. So yeah, I'm ready for any more questions. There was that one for the National Register at the beginning.
Right. I think we'll go with Deb's first because I think it's about what you were just talking about. So Deb wrote, was it Chicago Architecture Foundation?
Yes, that probably is it. It has a very pale yellow color in their header. I can picture the website, but I can't think of the name of it. But that sounds about right.
And the NR nomination question is it okay to just attach an NR nomination to the local landmark form rather than copying bits over to the local form?
You can definitely do that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I would suggest, again, from that point of view of thinking for that next researcher, that next person, that next generation that's going to look at that document, it would also be good to include a cover sheet that gives that elevator speech, that summary paragraph of why it's significant, and then especially how it relates to the criteria of your law. So if we're talking about the city of Buffalo, we have 9 criteria written into our law. So to be a local landmark, you have to meet one or more of those criteria. If you're landmarking a building that's already been listed on the National Register, yep, it's all written, that history is already there. You don't need to regurgitate it, copy and paste it, or try to come up with a new way to say it. You can just give them that National Register nomination. But that National Register nomination is not going to articulate how that resource meets the city of Buffalo's criteria and which of those criteria you think it meets. So it would be good and helpful to include a cover sheet that just clarifies this is why it's historic and these are the criteria it meets and why. That would be really helpful. But again, depending on your community, you might not need to do that. Maybe your actual preservation commission might do that. So again, it depends on your locality and what we're talking about, but it's always good to include kind of that cover sheet to it. That's a good question.
Okay, our next question is from Mary. Is there a digital source for bio of WNY architects, some kind of local chapter of Western New York?
So there is a website out there that's called Buffalo. Buffalo is an architectural museum. I forget what the actual correct title of the website is, but it was made by, architecture enthusiasts, historians and architectural historians and enthusiasts. And it does have a lot of information about Buffalo architects, individual buildings, architecture in general. It's a great resource. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that there's ways that we in casual conversation or just regular day-to-day talk about preservation, talk about architecture and the terms that we use. There's a language that we use in regular conversation, and then there's a language that we use in the professional setting. And so while we might, again, for example, a real estate description, that real estate agent or, website, random websites on the internet might describe a building as a Cape Cod. that's not necessarily an actual technical preservation term to describe a building. So that website, the Buffalo's an Architectural Museum, or the Buffalo Architecture website, is super great and has tons of information. But because a lot of that information is just copied and pasted from other sources, there might need to be a little bit of fact checking to confirm, are those the correct terms that we are still using to describe that building? Maybe there's been newer research on that property. So at the time that that page for that architect or that building was created, this is what we thought the story was, but there's been subsequent information discovered, and maybe there's a new story for that. So definitely using that website as a source, but it should be used in conjunction with a variety of other sources as well. Questions?
Yes, one more question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be
so far. We have one more question. And I think this is one that you get a lot. I know because I answer the phones. Where do we get the paperwork to start a nomination? How long will it take to receive a nomination?
Yeah, so back to that, I'm going to go back to that little diagram. In New York State, for better or worse, I went too far. Oh no, I didn't go far enough. There we go. So in other states, and you can go on the federal government's website. The National Park Service has, if you Google National Register forms and you go to the National Park Service's website for the National Register, they do have Word doc versions of that application form that you can download. But here in New York State, our SHPO is a lot more hands-on in this process, because they don't want to waste your time by having you do this research and start drafting something when it might not be eligible. And they don't want to waste their time or the National Park Service time working on reviewing a document if it's not going to be a successful nomination. So I would highly recommend not going and getting that form and starting to draft on your own. I really do strongly suggest starting that conversation with SHPO, reaching out to that staff person that's assigned to Erie County. You can go to SHPO's website, go to the contact page and figure out who you should email, but it's a lot easier. You can email me and I can connect you to the right person that you need to talk to, but it is much better process to first have that conversation with that staff person to make sure that this is going to be a successful that you will be able to move forward with that National Register process. Again, like I said, National Park Service has the updated current forms on their website. If you go and look at them, they are a nightmare of crazy weird word formatting. And when you look at the National Register nominations coming out of New York State, we're actually still, and SHPO supports the use of the old form. So that's another reason why, not just going blindly on what the internet says. You want to talk to the SHPO representative and staff person and make sure you're using the form they want you to use and doing it the way that they are advising you to do. Each nomination, the length is going to be completely dependent on the resource that you're talking about, the information that you need to, explain the history of that property and justify how it meets that criteria. Because again, it's not just, when we're talking about the National Register, it's not just a history paper on what happened there and how it was built and who lived there or whatever. It's how that narrative, that significance then relates to the broader context of history, how that collection of facts then supports meeting those various criteria. So you could explain that in 5 pages, you could explain that in 200 pages. What I will say is that the trends of National Register nominations is that they are getting longer and longer and longer. If you look at National Register nominations from that first generation, because the National Register was created in 1966. So you see those first National Register nominations happening in the 70s and 80s. They are the flimsiest of thinnest documents that you could ever see in your life. You're talking National Register nominations for incredibly important buildings with very complicated histories being 2 or 3 pages long. Now we are looking at very sizable nominations, and that's good. I mean, it's kind of stinks because you're going to have to do a lot more work and spend a lot more time on it, but it is incredibly better than the old nominations, because if you look at those old nominations, you don't know where they got their information from. They're making grand claims about history that don't really show up or supported in those citations or those bibliographies. So while our nominations today are infinitely longer than they used to be, it has so much more information in them, and it has those citations and that full bibliography. So then they are research documents in their own right. And that's what we want out of this. Because again, it's not just about landmarking and protecting and honoring that individual site. It's about adding more information to the record so that we can use it to fully understand and appreciate all of our built environment. So making sure that they do have all of those details is really, really important.
It doesn't look like you have any more questions, although you have been nominated for president.
I
Congratulations.
just saw that. Thank you so very much. I am honored. I will not accept it, but it's really wonderful to be mentioned. I'm going to go back to the end page just so we end up, or I'll just stop this share. All right. Well, if that is all of the questions tonight, thank you so very much to everyone again. Have a great rest of your evening. You know how to find us if you do come up with extra questions. And I hope to see some of you join us at the awards next week. Have a great weekend, everybody.